In 1807, a single decree signed in Berlin set in motion the collapse of an empire, not through war, through economics. And the man who signed it would be dead within 15 years, defeated not by armies, but by the very weapon he thought would win him Europe. Most people know Napoleon as a military genius. Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram. Battles won through speed and violence. But there's another story, one taught less often. Between 1806 and 1812, Napoleon attempted something no European power had tried at that scale: economic warfare. Total economic warfare. He called it the continental system. The goal was simple: cut Britain off from Europe, starve its economy, force surrender without firing a shot. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it destroyed him. The official history tells us Napoleon lost because he invaded Russia. That's true, but incomplete. The question is why he invaded Russia in the first place. The answer lies not in military strategy, but in smuggling routes, tariff violations, and the price of sugar in Paris. This is the story of how an economic blockade became a noose, and how the man who tightened it found his own neck inside. Britain in 1805 was not just a rival. It was the world's dominant trading power. Its navy controlled the seas. Its merchants controlled global commerce. Its industrial revolution was accelerating. Cotton mills in Manchester, ironworks in Birmingham, a financial system in London that could fund wars across continents. Napoleon understood something crucial. You cannot invade Britain. The channel is too wide, the Royal Navy too strong. So he would strangle it instead. If he could close every port in Europe, deny Britain its markets, its raw materials, its customers, the British economy would collapse. Unemployment would rise, tax revenues would fall, the government would be forced to negotiate. That was the theory. On November 21st, 1806, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree. It forbade any country under French control from trading with Britain. Any ship that touched a British port was banned from European harbors. Any British goods found on the continent would be seized and burned. France controlled most of Europe by this point: Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, the German states, Poland. The decree, in effect, turned Europe into a closed economic zone, a fortress, and Britain was outside. Britain responded with the Orders in Council. Any ship trading with France or its allies had to first stop in Britain and pay duties. Napoleon countered with the Milan Decree. Any ship that complied with British rules would be seized by France. The result was a trap. Neutral ships, particularly American ones, were caught in the middle. Trade with either side meant punishment by the other. Global commerce slowed, insurance rates spiked, shipping companies went bankrupt. But the real damage was not to neutral powers, it was to the countries enforcing the blockade. Here's the mechanism most people miss. Economic warfare works in theory. In practice, it requires total compliance. Every port, every border, every customs officer must enforce it. If even one country cheats, the system leaks. And humans, when faced with profit, cheat. Napoleon controlled the laws. He did not control human nature. Consider the Netherlands. Before 1806, Dutch merchants thrived on trade with Britain: textiles, colonial goods, grain. The continental system made that illegal. Overnight, entire industries collapsed. Unemployment rose. Tax revenues fell. The Dutch government, nominally allied with France, faced a choice: enforce the blockade and watch the economy collapse, or look the other way while smugglers operated. They chose survival. By 1809, smuggling through Dutch ports was rampant. British goods flowed into Europe through fake labels, bribes, and forged documents. Napoleon sent troops to enforce compliance. The troops took bribes too. Portugal offers another example. In 1807, Napoleon demanded Portugal close its ports to Britain. Portugal refused. Britain was its oldest ally, and its economy depended on British trade: wine, cork, textiles. Napoleon invaded. Spanish and French troops marched into Lisbon. The Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil. The occupation lasted years. It drained French resources, tied down troops, and sparked a brutal guerrilla war, all to close one country's ports. The cost far exceeded any economic benefit. But Napoleon could not allow exceptions. One open port would undermine the entire system. Russia is where the system broke completely. Tsar Alexander I initially supported the continental system. After the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, Russia agreed to cut ties with Britain. But Russia's economy depended on exports: timber, grain, hemp. Its primary customer was Britain. Russian landowners, nobles, merchants all watched their incomes collapse. By 1810, the pressure was unbearable. Alexander quietly began issuing licenses that allowed Russian ships to trade with Britain under neutral flags. It was a violation, and Napoleon knew it. He sent warnings. Alexander ignored them. In 1812, Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen and marched into Russia. The invasion was not about territory. It was about enforcing an economic blockade that was already failing. The invasion of Russia is well documented. The Grande Armée, over 600,000 men, entered in June. By December, fewer than 100,000 staggered back out. The rest were dead, captured, or deserted. Cold, hunger, disease, and Russian resistance destroyed them. But this catastrophe has a cause. Napoleon invaded because the continental system demanded it. If Russia traded with Britain, other countries would follow. The blockade would collapse. His credibility, his control, would collapse with it. So he invaded. The decision was economic before it was military. The consequences were fatal. While Napoleon bled in Russia, Britain adapted. Its economy did suffer. Exports fell. Unemployment rose in manufacturing centers. There were riots in 1811 and 1812. But Britain had advantages Napoleon underestimated. First, its navy allowed it to find new markets: Latin America, the Ottoman Empire, India. British merchants shifted focus. Second, Britain controlled the seas, which meant it controlled smuggling. British goods entered Europe constantly, through Spain, through Italy, through the Baltic. Third, Britain's financial system was more resilient. The Bank of England, private credit, a taxation system that could sustain debt. France had no equivalent. Napoleon funded wars through plunder and conquest. When those stopped, his treasury emptied. There's a deeper pattern here, one visible across history. Economic blockades rarely work as intended. They create smuggling, corruption, and enforcement costs that exceed the damage inflicted. They require total control, which no state possesses. And they assume the target will break before the enforcer does. That assumption is usually wrong. Consider the American embargo of 1807. President Jefferson, trying to avoid war with Britain and France, banned all American exports. The goal was to pressure both sides by withholding American goods. The result was the collapse of American shipping, massive smuggling into Canada, economic depression in New England, and zero change in European policy. The embargo was repealed in 1809. It harmed America more than its targets. Or consider Germany in World War I. The British naval blockade cut Germany off from global trade. Food imports stopped. By 1918, Germany was starving. The blockade contributed to the German surrender, but it took 4 years, cost millions of lives, and required the British Navy to control every shipping lane in the Atlantic. Even then, smuggling through neutral countries continued throughout the war. Total blockades are nearly impossible to maintain. Or consider the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Western embargoes on technology and trade were meant to slow Soviet development. They did to an extent. But the Soviet Union adapted, developed its own industries, traded with other communist states, and survived for decades. The embargoes caused pain, but not collapse. Collapse came from internal factors, not external pressure. The pattern is consistent. Economic warfare can inflict damage. It rarely achieves its primary goal, and it often backfires on the aggressor. Napoleon's continental system is the clearest example. It damaged Britain, but not enough. It damaged France and its allies more, and it forced Napoleon into conflicts he could not win against enemies who had nothing left to lose. By 1813, the continental system was dead. Napoleon's empire was collapsing. Spain was in revolt. Germany turned against him. Britain funded coalition after coalition. At Leipzig in October 1813, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden. He lost. 6 months later, Allied forces entered Paris. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to Elba. He returned briefly in 1815, only to lose at Waterloo. By 1821, he was dead on a remote island in the Atlantic, a prisoner of the British Empire he had tried to starve. The continental system failed because it required something impossible: the total control of human behavior across an entire continent. It assumed people would obey laws that destroyed their livelihoods. It assumed nations would enforce policies that bankrupted them. It assumed Britain would collapse before Europe did. All three assumptions were wrong. The system created more enemies than it defeated. It turned allies into smugglers, smugglers into resistors, resistors into invaders. And the man who built it spent his final years in exile, guarded by the same British Navy he had tried to break. This matters today because the same logic still appears. Sanctions as a tool of statecraft, blockades as a substitute for war. The belief that economic pressure can force political change without the cost of violence. Sometimes it works. Often it does not. The mechanisms remain the same. Smuggling adapts faster than enforcement. Populations suffer before governments yield. And the country imposing the blockade pays a price too, in enforcement, in lost trade, in damaged relationships. Napoleon understood war. He thought he understood economics. The difference destroyed him. The lesson is not that economic warfare never works. It's that it works far less often than those who deploy it expect. And when it fails, the costs are not always visible in battles or treaties. They appear years later in bankrupt economies, in invaded countries, in exiled emperors. Napoleon wanted to avoid invading Britain, so he chose economics instead. The choice led him to Moscow, and Moscow led him to St. Helena. The Berlin Decree was signed in 1806. By 1815, Napoleon was finished. 9 years. That's how long it took for an economic weapon to destroy the man who created it. History remembers him as a conqueror. But in the end, he was defeated by sugar prices, smuggling routes, and the simple fact that people will trade no matter what the law says. There are no blockades that do not leak, and every leak requires force to seal. Eventually, the force runs out.